Thank you so much for inviting me. This is, usually sometimes, I'm overbooked, but when you told me what the topic was, I immediately said yes. This is a deep-seated interest of mine, and mostly for autobiographical reasons. I grew up in different secular settings. I grew up in Germany, in secularized Europe. Then also part of my life, significant chunk of my life, I spent in socialist Yugoslavia, which is basically one party, sort of communist party ruling situation that was there until the beginning of the 90s. So that was a unique type of secularism as well. I will talk about it a little bit later. But mostly why this topic concerns me is because I have friends. I have family members who are, for all practical purposes, can be described as secular. They're not secular in identical ways. They are secular in different ways, and they have different life stories feeding into their experience, or they're sort of inhabiting this space of secularism. And so I've been wrestling with this. And obviously, as a pastor, I used to pastor, now as a teacher of future pastors, for me, the question, what does it mean to live, exist, minister in a secular age, is really at the forefront of my concerns. So I see then two people in particular that I noticed have joined here. I don't see their videos, but I see Nick Miller and David Hamstra, and both of them will be very familiar with what I'm going to share. And so I would invite them later on to correct me and to raise some critical questions about the material they know all too well. And I want to begin actually by sharing some slides, if that is okay with you, and because that way I can share some quotes here. And I want to begin with a quote that again will be familiar to some, but kind of to set the stage for our conversation here. And it is a quote from the book, How Not to Be Secular, by James K. Smith. And this is how he begins the book, the very beginning of the book. He writes, so you're a pastor or a church planter, and you don't have to be a pastor or church planter. You can be a person living in those settings, right? In Brooklyn, Berkeley, Boulder, Boston, whatever it is, right? Maybe you received a call to transport yourself from Georgia and Grand Rapids, or some other religious region of the country, sensing a burden to proclaim the gospel in one of the many so-called godless urban regions of North America. It is a paradox for me that I now live in Berrien Springs for most of my life. I lived in urban settings, and including Chicago, for many years. You've led your Jerusalem on a mission to Babylon. You came with what you thought were all the answers to the unanswered questions these secular people had. You're going to bring Jesus to them. You're going to bring the gospel to them, all the answers for which they are looking. But it didn't take long for you to realize that the questions were not just unanswered, they were unasked. And they weren't questions. That is, your secular neighbors aren't looking for answers, for some bit of information that was missing from their mental maps. To the contrary, they have completely different maps. You've realized that instead of nagging questions about God or the afterlife, your neighbors are oriented by all sorts of longings and projects and quests for significance. I mean, this is as if someone has looked at the life of some of my family members and friends and actually observed them and written down this paragraph. I mean, that is exactly how it is. Not with everyone, but with some people for sure. There doesn't seem to be anything missing from their lives. So you can't just come proclaiming the good news of a Jesus who will fill their God-shaped hole. They don't have any sense that the secular lives they've constructed are missing a second floor. Right? That there's no missing sense of anything missing. In many ways, they've constructed webs of meaning that provide almost all the significance they need in their lives. Though a lot hinges on that almost. And so hopefully we will return to this parenthetical here statement towards the end. So this was kind of the quote that really has animated my thinking quite a bit, and was actually at the background of my concerns when we here in the seminary had a seminar for doctoral students and other students, of which David Hamstra was a part of that. I don't know if he's here, but he was a part of that. And we read this almost like 900-page book, exploring this really work on the question of what is the secular age, and how do we understand secularism, and how do we understand processes of secularism. And it was, for me, just absolutely amazing. Not that I agree with everything he says, but in terms of helping me understand myself, some of the questions I have and struggles I have had and sometimes still have, and helping me understand former students who came to Andrews and now they completely live non-religious lives, and my family members. The book provided me with an understanding and vocabulary that I am deeply grateful for. The book is very unusual, and some people have described kind of a meandering quality to all of this, because basically, as one author said, you have these kind of breadcrumbs that go from medieval monasticism to kind of urbanization and German philosophy, and seems to be incredibly meandering, like a medieval town. By the way, these are the streets of a famous town close to where I live in Croatia, or where I'm from in Croatia. So it almost, these small towns, right? You go through these tiny little streets. You don't exactly know where they are leading. They usually go upwards towards the church on top of this sort of peninsula or island or whatever they are, right? They go up, but you don't know exactly where they lead you to. And this is how Tyler's book is. And many people find it to be frustrating. And they say, well, why doesn't he give us like steps and organization? But then you realize what he tries to do. He doesn't simply try to give you a definition. Okay, this is secularism, and these are 1, 2, 3, 4 stages that led to the secular age. But he tries to give you a feel. He wants you to feel in your bones, like, what does it mean to be a secular person? And for that, the best way to get at that, barring a conversation that you have with a friend, right, who describes himself or is secular, is that you understand all the multiple rivulets, the tiny little brooks and rivers that have contributed to the formation of our age. There isn't one single cause. There isn't one single narrative. There are many actors, many dramatis persona, many different people, many different movements, many different ideologies that were sometimes opposed, sometimes complementary, faced with a number of historical, interlaced or interfaced with a number of sociological and historical factors, contributing to this kind of contemporary sense of secularization that we are experiencing in this country as well, which is lagging behind, for sure, Europe, to the best of my understanding and to the best of my experience. This is a different feel in America than what you have. I would imagine in Canada as well, and also in Western Europe. So this is what the book was all about, and it was quite important. So I thought perhaps, rather than summarizing the book and telling you a lot about Taylor, to simply summarize perhaps or mention a couple of key terms that he's using, and use these terms then as a springboard to sort of introduce to you some of his ideas, but also to open up discussion at the end of this presentation. So first of all, that you need to know is that at the beginning, he offers us like different definitions of the secular, right? I mean, secular has different kind of meanings to that. And for one definition of secular simply means where we kind of separate we would say the kind of the religious aspect of our lives, let's say prayer, worship, church, all of this, and then the more kind of other aspect of our lives, which are vocation, entertainment, whatever, and all of this. Now, many people have critiqued this bifurcation of secular and sacred. But sometimes that's what we mean by secular. There's another meaning of secular, and it has to do with this idea more developed in modernity in the last 200-300 years, where secular refers to this a-religious public sphere, right? Where the public sphere, and including the sciences, are objective, either driven by scientific method or driven by data, or driven by just simply by the sciences and public deliberations in a democratic society. And whereas the religious is kind of something that has been left behind because it is superstitious, it is subjective, it is non-scientific, and all of that. That is one sort of type of secular. And I won't go into this, but sometimes that understanding of secular is even operative in a Christian campus, such as Andrews University, where sometimes you perceive that the science complex is where we do kind of objective scientific thinking, right? And the function of the religion department is not so much about raising questions of some sort of questions of reality, but kind of providing devotional props or encouragement to students. This kind of the bifurcation between science and opinion, or objectivity and subjectivity, can kind of infiltrate even a Christian university, unintentionally, and perhaps in a subterranean fashion, never clearly articulated. But for what he's interested, though, Charles Taylor, he's interested in an environment, in a society, in an age, in a context where religious beliefs are contested, where to believe is not anymore natural, it's not axiomatic, it is not a given thing, right? It's something that needs to be defended. It's something that needs to be constantly polished, and the weed has to be taken out. And you can never really rest in that. And that really came to me to the fore, right? As I was thinking, a couple of friends of mine who, I mentioned of two individuals in particular, Ryan Bell, who used to be a pastor, Adventist pastor, and became essentially an agnostic. I don't know if he would call himself agnostic or atheist. And then have another friend of mine who was actually the dean or the professor of theology and philosophy at our seminary in Croatia, and an extremely brilliant and smart man who was a philosophy student, got converted. He's just one of the greatest intellects I've seen in our church, although he has not produced much in terms of writings. But he now came out not just as an agnostic, but as an atheist. I mean, these kind of stories, many stories. Some of you might know Joshua Harris, who wrote Kissing Dating Goodbye, who not only completely refuted that book, but does not consider himself anymore a Christian, although he was a very influential pastor for many years. And so this situation, right? This was absolutely unheard of. Like, do you know of any Adventist pastor, let's say 50 years ago, or even less, who would not just be disillusioned and burned out, and then perhaps leave ministry and become a lax Christian, or perhaps has troubles with some Adventist beliefs and then becomes some sort of generic evangelical or something like that, or perhaps even some high church sort of person, right? That was possible. I mean, we had stories like that. But this kind of possibility that a pastor who had a conversion, who preached, can become a flat out atheist, I mean, that for me is so profoundly indicative of these pressures that we're experiencing in the secular context. And of course, there are many, as I mentioned before already, there are many types of secularity. The secularity of my close family members who used to be Adventists and are not anymore, is different in its feel, right? It's different. It is more perhaps cynical and all of that. Then let's say the secularism of my father, who always has this very negative sort of view of organized religion, hates the Bible, in the name of which so many crimes were committed. And that again is very different than the secularism of kind of the Communist Party members, people in my classroom where I grew up in Yugoslavia, which is again has a different feel to that. So, and that will also come back at the end. That is why I believe it is really impossible to have a specific method. Okay, here's the method by which you're now, quote unquote, going to reach secular people. That doesn't really work. I mean, every person is different. Experiences, and you have to understand where they're coming from, and perhaps talk to them or even witness to them in very different ways. Another concept that, in addition to secular, that he develops is this idea of reform, and he traces these different reform movements, beginning with monasticism, and then later also he, as a Catholic, perhaps reads Protestant Reformation in a more negative light than perhaps certainly we would. And by the way, just a caveat, in case you don't know who Charles Taylor is, he certainly is today one of the leading philosophers of our age. He is a Canadian. He ran for a political office in Canada at one point. He's an expert on Hegel and other philosophers. So this is a person who is incredibly erudite and kind of encyclopedic knowledge of many things. But it doesn't mean that he's always correct. But he traces these kind of changes to these reforms, that the reform movements. And just to show you what I mean by this is from a review of Charles Taylor's book by, actually, incidentally, a Croatian scholar who is teaching in the US, Lavica Jakelic. And she notes the following, right? These reform movements that happened, which try to bring religion closer from the monasteries and kind of from the church more into the public domain. It seems to be kind of a very good move, right? But that kind of move had some unintended consequences, not essential consequences, but actually consequences nevertheless. She writes, although profoundly embedded in the theological and historical development of Western Christianity, the unintended and gradual consequences of the drive to reform were radically secular, shaping the view that what human beings owe to God is the achievement of their own good. The drive to reform contributed to the fading of the sense of mystery. This has to do with the rise of the burger class, urbanization, small towns, merchants, this kind of nascent capitalist sort of nascent capitalism that is developing in the 16th, 17th century, and so on and so forth. It inaugurated a vision of human agency, of us as humans being able to construct and reconstruct the world. A belief that each human being can work on herself to achieve a good life and collectively shape a good society. So God has given us all these powers. God has given us a sense of He's given us capacities. He helps us to develop these virtues. He helps us to be industrious. And so we try to serve God through our work. But eventually what is taking place is that people realize, well, yeah, so I can do this on my own. Like God kind of gives these tools, but then we create kind of our own world, right? And that was one of the kind of initial steps that led to the secularization. She continues, the drive to reform was a process of democratization of virtue. So anyone can now be virtuous, can be moral, simply by, pulling yourself by the shoestrings. You just live this life, right? Not really depending on God. It embodied confidence in the ability of human beings to create conditions of human flourishing. Now, we are now creating these conditions, right? And if David Hamstra, if he ever participates in this conversation, if he's around here, he will tell you that this kind of idea that we can create our human flourishing apart from God, that his human flourishing is understood completely in these secular terms, non-religious terms, is something that also pressurizes Adventism on numerous levels. So then as a result of this development and reform, we have, this is another concept in Taylor, the developing of the modern moral order, right? That we now have this morality organized for the benefit of society without any reference to anything that is above, that is God, that is slowly developing, right? There's some quotes here. As a matter of fact, I might skip off this. I will send you a link of these slides if anyone wants to go back to some of these quotes. But this is a great quote article by, I believe in the New York magazine, yes, on I Used to Be a Human Being, where he, among other, actually engages Taylor and writes about how modernity, as you can see here, slowly weakens spirituality by design and accident in favor of commerce. So this economic factor is actually very important in this whole secularization that's happening in the West. I find this quote to be beautiful. So let me just read it here. It says, "The reason we live in a culture increasingly without faith is not because science has somehow disproved the unprovable, but because the white noise of secularism has removed the very stillness in which it might endure or be reborn." I think that is a polemical claim, one that is very, very interesting. And one could think creatively already, well, how do practices such as Sabbath observance and practices of solitude and connecting with nature, building these different bridges of resonance with others, with nature, with solitude, how could that be a way of combating the effect of secularism, right? And how does urbanization and living in cities, how does that connect with this whole thing, right? So then the result of all of this, he says, is this kind of immanent frame, right? Is this kind of situation in where people are living their lives without any recourse to God. And again, might sound kind of a strange term, a technical term, but so aptly describes many, many friends of mine who have either lost faith or are still perhaps struggling with that. You know, and once you step into this, it becomes very difficult to extricate yourself. There's a guy at the University of Chicago where I studied. He studied theology, religion, and lost his faith. And so he was so, seeking for God. And one day he's walking, and there's the starry heaven up there. He looks at the stars and he says, God, if you exist, please right now, this moment, let me see a shooting star right now. I mean, it was not a night where you had a lot of shooting stars. There were no shooting stars. But that moment, a shooting star appears in heaven. And he looks up and he says, wow, what a coincidence, right? so you see, this is kind of this kind of thinking that easily takes place, right? And then, of course, these are kind of related, overlapping terms of kind of exclusive humanism. Again, is a kind of living human lives without any appeal to any kind of transcendent source, God, religion, and all of this. Now, and this is now where it becomes really difficult, interesting, and I want slowly to bring this now to a conclusion. That what he so powerfully does, right, is that in his book, Taylor, that he kind of questions this narrative, from we have this age of religion, and now we move into this kind of whatever secular age, one that is a-religious. And he denies that. He says, in fact, what we have is a jostling, confrontation of numerous possibilities of how to live human life, right? So, and these cross pressures on the one hand are more coming from the immanent frame, this temptation to live your lives without any reference to any sort of, again, notion of the divine. But at the same time, there's the pressure, the presence of religion. There's this kind of alternatives that are still around there, and that creates kind of an interesting permutation, mix, kaleidoscope of a plurality of options that people are being exposed through different venues and through different means. And sort of the result of this cross pressure is what he terms the Nova effect, right? And if I can read it here on the side here, right? He says this explosion, this cross pressure brings different options of third ways for belief in meaning in secular 3H, right? Where you have many of these different options, right? Why not be an environmentalist activist? Why not a social justice activist? Why not be the kinds of different pursuits and meanings and purposes in life, some of which are compatible and some of which are incompatible? And you can see how in this context, people are sort of trying often to express some longings for spirituality without any reference to God or any reference to the transcendent, right? For example, this interesting book by the little book of atheist spirituality tries to, very different than some of these kind of new atheists like, Dennett Hitchens and Harris and people like that, Dawkins. These are people who are not so critical of religion, but try to say, how can a irreligious person, a person who lives in this immanent frame, how can we perhaps still talk about these spiritual longings? And that is, he's actually, and I'm not French speaking, so I won't even try to pronounce his name, but he's actually a very significant public intellectual in France, and his books have been bestsellers. Another book you can see by the subtitle here, right? Reading the Western classics to find meaning in a secular age, trying to find the luminosity of something more, right? Of beauty, of goodness, but completely without any reference to the divine. Or, perhaps this Religion for Atheists, a non-believer's guide to uses of de Botton, Alain de Botton wrote this book, right? Religion for Atheists, a non-believer's guide to the use of religion. And again, very much like this. And you can see that part of this groping for alternative ways of life is really a resurgence in our culture of Stoicism, which used to be the dominant philosophical school during the time of Paul and early Christianity. Stoicism, bar none, was the most significant and important alternative to Christianity. And we have republication of books, people reading Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and all of this. You have websites like the Daily Stoic. You have Ryan Holiday wrote a number of books on Stoicism. If you know anything, about Tim Ferriss, famous podcaster and author and investor, always frequently talk about this. And you can see in Silicon Valley, there's this kind of renewed and deep interest in Stoicism. And even the New York Times quite recently wrote an article came out on that. And you can see that the Stoicism really becomes this alternative sort of immanentist reality. And so as you can see here at the bottom, I just have like 3 more slides, and then we can go to the conversation, to questions. And so this is basically the final concept I want to mention in Taylor. It is this notion of fragilization, right? And it is this idea, right? If you were a Christian in the 16th century, there really wasn't a danger for you to become an agnostic or an atheist. Like you could become a heretic, but really not an atheist. It wasn't really there. I mean, there could be some exceptions. We don't know if people like Spinoza later on were atheists and all of that. But it's not really very, very common. Right now, all of us feel pressure. Right? Most people, even when we're in the deepest sort of faith, we see kind of at the margins, perhaps completely in some side corner of our religious lives, the possibility of doubt, right? And the possibility of questioning, or some abyss that is lurking very, very far in the distance is somehow there. Now, if you have your walk with God and you are strong in your faith, this is really at the farthest periphery of your consciousness and your life. But just try and drop your walk with God and connection with church. And the inertia that is driving you to these alternative options will be just incredibly, incredibly strong. But what's also happening is on the other side, right? That people who are so firm in their irreligious postures, they also face the possibility of belief at the margins. And this is something that brings hope. I would highly recommend to you, I won't be able to read this, but I would highly recommend to you that you Google this article. And it is really James K. Smith who wrote this book, the quote that I shared from in the very beginning, the book on Charles Taylor, actually assigned the secular age, this humongous, difficult, dense philosophical book, to his college students at Calvin College. And he writes the experience they had in the class, that these kids simply couldn't believe. It sounds as if Charles Taylor was basically looking over their lives and taking notes and writing this book. He has unpacked many of the struggles and tensions that people have. It is a short article, very nice, highly recommended. But in the article, he has this one quote, and then we come to the discussion question. He says, Taylor explains that it's not only believers who suffer from doubt, right? In a secular age, the unbeliever can find herself tempted to believe. This is this fragilization in the context of this, Nova effect that we are facing. She may take up yoga or sacrificially devote herself to causes of justice, or find herself strangely attracted to the Dominican nuns down the street who keep inviting her to spiritual retreats. The doubter's doubt is faith. As the novelist Julian Barnes admitted in his memoir, Nothing to be Frightened of, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. And this is what he means by the notion of the secular age. Taylor means being a haunted age, right? That, yes, you have people who are totally brazen in their unbelief, and they would never admit that they have any kind of longings. Christopher Hitchens said famously, that if it happens that at the end of my life, I ask for God at my deathbed, please know in advance it is only because I'm in a delirium and I am not anymore, I have lost sanity, right? So some people who are very stringent in their unbelief. But this is not where most people find themselves. People look for these alternative places of transcendence. And they look for them because I believe that the Holy Spirit works in people's lives. The way he worked with C.S. Lewis and spoke to him through modern mythology, the way he worked in the lives of other people, the Lord who writes the divine law on our heart, even in the heart of unbelievers, Jesus Christ, who is the light that shines, illuminates all the world, as we're being told in John, in the Gospel of John. It is still true, it is still there. So we will always have these longings for transcendence being expressed either through poetry or either these very different ways of life. So here's a question, perhaps if you can discuss it. Like, where do we go from here in a very generic sense? And perhaps as you discuss, perhaps you can share, first of all, struggles, if any of this speaks to you, or if you see that any of this speaks to the lives of some of your friends, or perhaps if you have a number of friends who are secular, how does their secularity compare? What are the causes? What are the expressions of that? What are the overlaps and the differences, in other words? And finally, like, what does it mean to express, articulate, live out a Christian witness in such a context and such an age? So these would be some of the questions, and I hope that you will find them to be meaningful and useful as we now discuss them.